asked me that, can we do these sessions at this time? And I said, yeah, that'll work.
Okay.
No problem.
Okay, that's
Good
great.
stuff. So I have one of my colleagues called Kep who's joining us in this session. He's just going to be observing because it's a bit of a training for him. So he's just going to be observing some of the sessions that we are doing, and the idea is to get him trained on conducting some of these Zoom sessions. So
Okay.
he'll be a silent listener in the background, but we'll crack on with our discussions.
Okay, sure.
So what we are looking at doing today is obviously going into learning outcome 2, which is continuing with the unit health and safety management practice. And I think what we'll look at is bits and pieces related to understanding the process of, leading and controlling health and safety practices in the workplace.
Okay.
This particular learning outcome also has 3 assessment criteria. So we'll be going into some bits of it to understand what is the overview, of the learning outcome, which is what we call the helicopter view. So understand what the outcome is asking us to study. And then we'll get into detailing of roles of related to board member, senior management, and then how do the roles get evaluated. And then finally, what are the resources and skills required to ensure that the implementation of the health and safety standards can happen within the organization. Just give me 1 second. I'll get a cup of glass of water before we start.
Sure.
So, couple of things which are important with regards to one, this particular learning outcome will be the governance part of it. And how does the management and the senior management or the board gets involved? Typically, when we do get to see accidents or incidences which tend to happen, which are related to mishaps with regards to I would say occupational health and safety. So in such cases, what you would generally have is that somebody senior enough in the organization taking responsibility. And why does it fall onto their shoulders? And obviously, why is it that these kind of lapses, which do tend to happen within organizations related to injuries or people getting hurt, or obviously in some cases it's not just humans, but physical property and damage to the property. So in such cases, these have to be taken quite seriously, and they are all related to the governance part of it.
Okay.
So we'll get into some part of this discussion using a PowerPoint presentation slide. So I'll switch you over to that, and then we will do a bit of discussion on this content. So the main parts that we are looking at primarily is governance, which is the key bit. Obviously, health and safety is a term which will be, as I mentioned previously, it will be overused in the course of the units that we study. But essentially, we are looking at, if I do away with the clutter, we are looking at governance, we are looking at standards, systems, and resources which are required to ensure that everyone's safe within the organization when they're working, and then looking at how goals, targets, and objectives are set, for different people who manage the occupational health and safety, or in general, I would say the environment in general, about the environment in which employees, staffs, contractors work, and how do they conduct regular audits and assessments to ensure that the skills are relevant, and obviously they have relevant resources in order to ensure that if there is a need which arises, then how do they go about essentially, securing everyone's safety in regards to the premises, physical safety, mental health being within the organization. Now, one of the key terms that we want to look at before we get into the discussion on this learning outcome is what is the role of governance, and what does governance constitute when we talk about the field of health and safety. So governance can be governance of an organization, governance of running a school, a charity. It could be any such organization. But essentially, what we are looking at is how do we look at the role of governance specifically within the health and safety area, because we are focused on studying health and safety, and obviously this is where we need to look at narrowing down on the definition of what is the role of governance within health and safety, and that is related to the word practice, because for every such goal, aim and objective to be successful in the organization, what we generally get to see is that we need to have an executive sponsor, somebody who's in the top management, on the board, or in the senior management, and who is actively taking part and is showing responsibility primarily for this area of maintaining health and safety standards within the organization, the implementation of policies, practices, and procedures within the organization, so that nobody's safety is compromised. The conditions in which employees, staff, contractors, workers are conducive, and any sort of risks to health or mental health being, well-being are not being compromised, and they are mitigated. So when we talk about governance, governance is going to be a system that will ensure that these safety standards are set within the organization, they are maintained, and obviously they are effectively regulated and audited once a year at least in most organizations, to ensure that everyone's safety. So safety in general, a broad term, but looking at everyone's safety means you're looking at health, well-being, physical safety, and safety of other types of infrastructure and resources, which could be ensured by following the standards which are required to be set within the organization. Now, when we talk about governance, we need to put things into perspective. That means leaders or people in the leadership position will always set goals. They will also be looking at monitoring the performance of their staff on those goals. They'll be also focused on ensuring that there is compliance related to certain matters being maintained. For example, a simple example that I would give you here is that if an organization takes on a new employee, they would need to follow the labor legislation within the country, and it can't be that you can employ this person at any salary. You'll have to look at minimum wages that will need to be paid. You'll have to look at the working time directive, and that would be looking at compliance side of things, which the management sets into policies and procedures when HR department goes into flow. So they will know very clearly there has to be a contract, there has to be minimum wage requirements, working directive, and ensuring holidays and other things like pension plans and all those things are provided, which are a part and parcel of what the government has stipulated as minimum regulation that people would need to follow. Then they will also be looking at fostering a culture. The most important thing of governance or senior management in the organization is that they lead the development of a culture within the organization. So if it comes from the top, then everybody understands that this is something which is required, and it creates an environment that promotes health and safety. So there would be journal mention of this in newsletters, in some sort of communication, annual communication, or in some sort of important updates which are normally sent out by the management, and they would generally have this area also included in other forms of communication that they do, whether it's related to finance, turnover, profitability, expansion, strategic plans, whatever it is. Health and safety would also be a part and parcel of it. So the idea here is, depending on the size and scale of the organization, they would be fostering a culture or trying to build an environment which will allow everyone to understand that this is quite an important aspect, both from an employer and an employee perspective, to follow and maintain health and safety practices within the organization. The other thing which you would look at in certain critical operations of the organization. So if I look at an airport, for example, in the airport, what will happen is, one of the clear things which the people within this role will be focused on, and the management will look at KPIs or key performance indicators, would be people managing incidents. For example, in a situation wherein there could be a crisis, in a situation where there could be a lapse of control or a lapse of not following the policy, and that lapse could lead to an incident. So the management or the governance side of things is focused on managing the incidents within the organization. That means they'll be very clear in terms of identifying, investigating, reporting, and near misses, even incidents. So incident means something has already happened, but they will also be very cautious on managing what are called near misses. That means if it could have led to this incident, then what are the things that need to be put in place to ensure that this does not happen? And when we talk about governance, who's responsible? The chief executive or the main person, chief, say, health and safety officer, would be reporting to the CEO. The CEO on that matters would report to the board. There could be, depending on the size and scale of the organization, various structures and committees within the organization. If I look at a large organization in the UK like Siemens or Tesco's or any other such large organization which has more than 3,000, 4,000, maybe 100,000 employees, you would generally see that there'll be boards and committees related to health and safety, standards. There'll be senior executives who will be designated in ensuring that the health and safety standards are maintained across premises. So these are organizations that I'm talking about, which do not have one location, one office, but have branch offices, various locations, and that is why it will also be quite important. And in some cases, in some of these organizations, the management would sanction what is called adequate budgets and funding for these safety standards to be maintained. Now, if I look at a big factory in Manchester like Kellogg's factory, they also have a safety department. So if a fire breaks out, the first line of control or the first action or protocol is normally done by the staff which is maintaining health and safety within the factory, and they are responsible for those standards. So there will be adequate financing and budgeting planned for such operations to be carried out, drills being carried out, across the year to ensure that these standards are maintained within the organization. And that is why I would say that health and safety governance is not just a legal, but a moral compliance from a point of view of employers, ensuring that they have an obligation towards people, workers, contractors working within the organization. And that is why it is quite important when the size and scale of the organization grows, you would generally see that there will be a number of people employed within that particular role and responsibility area to ensure safety standards or health and safety standards within the organization.
Okay, I have just one question. So, so what's the difference between governance and procedure?
Okay, so governance will be responsible for setting the guidelines or providing the guidelines. Procedures would essentially be the nitty-gritty of the guidelines in terms of how to put it into action. So it's like saying policy and procedure. Policy talks about it's a document which basically ideologically talks about what is to be done. But procedure will tell you a step-by-step guide in terms of what needs to be followed if an incident is to occur. So similarly, governance, they will look at setting goals and objectives at that top level, which would say that we need to have a health and safety policy, we need to have this system in place, we need to have this audit in place, and management of this system in place. But how do we manage that system? How do we run that system within the organization is going to come from policies and procedures, which will be a step-by-step guide or a detailed guidance, which will be followed by employees who are actually working in that particular role. So one is a macro view of guidelines or statements, and those translated into actions when you have detailing of it available would essentially be available in what is called procedure.
Okay.
Is that okay?
Yeah.
So you have a health and safety policy within the organization. That policy might be made by the manager, but how it is implemented within the organization, there will be a procedure. The procedure will involve things like if this kind of an incident happens, then you need to log it in the incident logbook. This is the step that you need to call the health and safety executive. This incident needs to be logged. This is the first line of response. And these are the first line of things that you would need to do. And later on, it will also mention how would we look at a corrective action plan, CAP, and how do we look at a report that can be filed so that lessons can be learned so that this kind of an incident does not happen again in the organization. So that will be all detailed out in the procedure. Now, there's a very short video that I've shortlisted, which looks at giving us a bit of an overview of how does the management or people within the management and leadership position essentially look at putting down processes in place, procedures in place to manage work, health and safety. And this video is something that you can watch. It's a 3.5 minute video, and that tells you in 7 different steps how these standards can actually be maintained, within the organization. Now, this particular video is a short video, but in follow-up to this, you're also going to be looking at understanding in this video the broader steps of, because if I'm in governance and I'm wearing the hat of the managing director today, what I don't want to do is go into nitty-gritty of everything. So my role here would be to get people started on understanding what is health and safety within the organization. I would look at forming a team. That team would essentially then have different roles and responsibilities to manage this. There would be specifically somebody managing hazards or risks within the organization. there'll be somebody specifically managing or creating documentation to ensure that the workplace is safe. And in some cases, what we are also looking at is ensuring that somebody keeps records of everything. Everything is logged within the organization. And then the quality manager or the occupational health and safety manager responsible for ensuring that there's a continuous process to keep this in check. That means it's not a one-off thing that you do it once a year and then you forget about it. So it has to be a continuous process, and somebody would be holding that side of the rope to ensure that everything happens as per what has been described in the book or the procedure, and everything is up to date. And if there are lapses, if there are gap areas being discovered or detected, then there are appropriate plans or responses being put in place by the working, I would say, by people working within those roles to address those problems or areas which could become issues in the future. Now, the main aspect of today's, I would say, session is to understand and understand maybe in a table, or maybe the best way that I would put it this way would be to look at drawing up a particular table of, how, let me put it this way. So let me rephrase. What I would do is the first assessment criteria that we look at basically talks about the role of board and senior management in leading and controlling the health and safety policies or practices within our workplace. Now, this could be very well understood if I look at, charting out the role and responsibility of different people within board or senior management. And this can be best done using a table. And this table would essentially be, talking about who sets the health and safety policy within the organization, the agenda of the health and safety policy, what all does it cover. Now, this health and safety policy could be different for different organizations. Now, we are a teaching organization and we are teaching predominantly online. We also have a health and safety policy, but our health and safety policy does not have the requirements of ensuring that, the difference between this policy and the interpretation of this policy is different to a policy in engineering or a refinery or in a hospital or a workplace which has moving, parts and obviously lots of things going in and going out. So how do we look at the management setting the or creating the health and safety policy, looking at what is their role in terms of, executing and implementing that policy within the organization. We then also look at what is the strategic objective or intent. Now, having a policy is fine, but if the organization expands in 2 years, if the workforce doubles in 2 years, then what is the strategic intent of that policy? How does that policy also grow? That is what we will look at. We look at monitoring and evaluation. How much and how frequently are the policies, procedures, safety standards implemented and monitored within the organization? How would they have an impact on legal and compliance? And last but not the least, is the management committed to training and, let's say, development? Because if a new employee joins, one of the main things with the organization would do is ask the person to do a training on health and safety. And that will be in the context of how the policy actually works for their organization, not a general health and safety thing. So if there are not enough budgets allocated to the implementation of the health and safety policy under training and development, then you would not see this being taken seriously within the organization. And then last but not the least, how does the management and review of this happen across the year is something that will need to be looked at, and that would be something which will fall into the remit of I would say the remit of board and the management. So at the end of the year, when employees have annual appraisals and they have annual reviews, there would be somebody who would be carrying out an annual review in terms of health and safety practices within the organization. And that is what I would mention in the context of I would say this particular assessment criteria, that there would be somebody who would need to do this in this context, and that would be best described in the form of I would say, a table. So if I look at bringing this across for the purposes of our discussion, so if I say that what is the role of board and management within the implementation of this particular policy and policy related structure within a workplace, then I would primarily divide this into maybe a table like this. So here what we are looking at is looking at some of the broader aspects of what is the role the management plays when we do talk about the role of maintaining safety of all the employees within the organization or staff within the organization. So the first and foremost would be they would need to have some sort of a policy in place. And this policy would comply with any sort of legislation or regulation of the government in that country. They would then have a bit of commitment in terms of sponsoring and ensuring all the resources are available, financial, physical, administrative resources are available, and they would be required to run this and implement this policy within the organization. And then I would say there are other steps that they would need to look at is have adequate experienced resources working on this to be able to take this forward. Because if I'm the managing director, I wouldn't be running the health and safety department within the organization. It will be run by somebody else. But I would need to be able to empower that person or that department with financial resources, administrative resources, which would allow them to carry out their day-to-day responsibilities and duties within the organization. And then obviously some part of this would be dependent on working very closely with HR for training and development. Some part of this would be related to reporting with security. If there's a security within the organization or a department, that there's a head of security and the head of security has, his ears and eyes through CCTV or other forms of implementation of maintaining security of premises or, industrial facilities within the organization, then they would do so by such means wherein they're able to see incidents if they are happening, report incidents which are happening, like incidents like theft, breakage. It could be, say for example, incidents related to arson, or in some cases when we look at security during the during non-working hours being maintained by the staff, and in such cases, any such incident, they would have a protocol to follow. So if there's a break-in happening, the security staff would basically record it on CCTV, but straight away inform emergency services that there's a breakage happening, and they would be, looking at monitoring and, updating the key management on that particular situation. And this would require resources. Sometimes you would see that security in the premises is compromised because they do not have or put adequate staff in place because of financial constraints, and that could, kind of compromise security for an organization or the premises of that organization during non-working hours. So those are bits that the management or people within senior positions need to look at leading and controlling to ensure that health and safety, practices are followed within the organization. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Now, the second one that we look at is basically looking at the use of goals and targets and how would you set goals and target. So if I were to look at, talking about, let's say you go into this role and, provide, let's say, some sort of an understanding that if I'm the health and safety manager, what I want to do now is basically set some goals and objectives which could be used within the organization to maintain and work on these practices to ensure that everyone's safe. So how would you go about doing it if you were in that particular role? And if I were to say, can you set some goals and objectives, or if there are policies in place, can you put an implementation plan in place to ensure that everybody follows these policies and practices? How would you go about it?
Okay. Could you again repeat the question?
Okay, so in this particular task, what it is asking us to do is look at use of goals and targets in health and safety management, right? So if I were to look at planning, say, health and safety management, say for my own company, just as an example, how would you go about setting the goals and targets?
Okay.
Goals and targets that you would set.
Yeah. So I would meet with different teams
Yes,
and maybe discuss what are the major risks they have in place,
yes,
and maybe like do, of course, risk assessment. Then maybe try to set like SMART goals,
yes.
and like every maybe a month or quarter, just review them and see how do we progress them. And yeah, and act accordingly.
That's great. So basically looking at the PDCA cycle. If you recall, in the previous learning outcome, we did not we referred to the PDCA cycle, but actually did not discuss it in detail. So if I were to look at putting some goals and targets in place, what I would do is basically use the PDCA cycle, which is primarily plan,
And do check.
do, check. Yeah, that's correct.
Yeah.
Do, check, and act cycle. So the planning that I'm going to do when I set the goals are primarily going to be basis this particular framework. So planning would be to define specific purposes and metrics of how these targets are to be set. Implementation or do can be the changes that I want to make or the systems that I want to introduce to ensure that practices or safety is maintained. Checking would be the audits that you carry out to ensure that their procedures are being followed. A simple case in point that I mentioned earlier was that sometimes what you tend to see is that within organizations, there are fire drills which happen. There are, fire alarms drill which are normally done. And this is done to check whether there is readiness to, if there's an incident to happen, is there a readiness in the organization to be able to, work on this. And in last but not the least, in most cases, if the action has to be taken, then is there a planned or some sort of a stepwise approach available in the documentation? So if an incident is to happen, is there a planned, systematic, documented approach which is available to be able to take care of, this incident? That is what would be how you would go about essentially, planning, I would say, the goals and targets within the organization. Now, some parts of it, what you mentioned is absolutely correct, because you would meet with the team because you are in the board or the governance. Once you have met with your team, you would basically give them an understanding of why it is required to be done, how you're looking at planning this, and then at some stage, what you would do essentially would be to divide it into various tasks which they would follow through. And those tasks, when they follow through, would be maybe a table that you draw up or whatever, but they would essentially have purpose, some goals and objectives. They would align with the organizational strategy, because you're not creating a different strategy for health and safety vis-a-vis sales or turnover or marketing or engineering. They would have the SMART criteria, which you've clearly mentioned, because your targets would need to be specific, realistic, achievable, time bound. You would also look at employee engagement. You would obviously want the buy-in of the staff and the contractors. Like normally what happens in the college here is we have a head of security. The head of security normally would meet and greet with the visitors, and they would normally give them a card. And at some stage, they would have terms and conditions on the back of it to say that at all times when you're within the premises, you need to comply with these regulations. If you hear a fire alarm, this is the fire exit, or this is the assembly point. And if you do fall or go or lose your way within the college, then the best would be to come down to reception. So those are basic things that they brief the person on to ensure that there is engagement if anything is to go wrong. And then they monitor and review, in this case through CCTV, because each of the classrooms, each of the venues have a CCTV, so they can clearly see who's going in, going out. And last but not the least, if they face any challenges, they discuss it with their manager and obviously find ways to, overcome that particular problem. And this is the way that you would go about actually setting goals, targets, and then obviously aligning it with the targets and resources that are available, and then take it forward from a point of view of implementing it within the organization. Is that okay?
Yes.
Any questions?
And what is the optimal time for reviewing goals?
So depending on if we look at some guidelines which are available from the health and safety executive, if you're a business which is under some sort of classification with the number of employees working within the organization, they would normally recommend some sort of guidelines to say this is the ratio or this is the minimum ratio that you would need to have from a point of view of skilled people within the organization to maintain these standards. So for example, if it's a micro business, you have 0 to 10 employees. If it's a small business, 10 to 50 employees. If it's a medium enterprise, 50 to 250, anything larger than that, and you have multiple sites, or multiple office locations, then you would need to have these many things in place. For example, multiple people who are trained on fire and safety, people who are trained on health and safety can act as first responders, minimum availability of equipment like fire extinguishers, fire blankets, things like that. So there could be a list which the health and safety executive prescribes, depending on if you're in a service premises, lease premises, you own your premises, and that could be something which the health and safety manager or officer within the organization would need to have a good understanding of, so that they can plan for the resources. They can put a budget or a resource list in front of the management to say, this is what I need to maintain this, or this is what I need to implement the policies and procedures, and that's how it will go forward. Is that okay?
Yeah, because in the ISO standard for the health and safety, it mentions that the targets need to be reviewed at regular intervals. Does it?
Yes.
Yeah. So
Things could be done quarterly. So it could be based on the, say, for example, desk-based review could happen for documentation and policies once in 3 years, because it may require changes if there is changes in legislation or updates to acts or principles which are brought in by the government. Then you have physical equipment, you have infrastructure. And these things could be, say, for example, if there is an office and a branch office which is running air conditioning might need regular servicing depending on what is recommended by the manufacturer, plus also by the health and safety standards. So it will depend on certain types of guidance which is provided by health and safety departments, and they would need to be then read and implemented from an organizational point of view. You might not follow them, or you might not follow all of them, but you might need to follow some of them, which could be contextualized and then implemented related to how they are required in your organization.
Okay, makes sense. Yeah.
Now, the third, sorry, go on. Any other questions?
Yeah, it makes sense. Yeah, all good.
Okay. The third assessment criteria is talking about the resources and skills required to plan the health and safety practices within a workplace. So when we do talk about resources in general, there are lots of resources that we can talk about. Resources like human resources, administrative resources, physical resources. We can talk about resources which are related to specific equipment which is required to run some of these functions. So here the idea is, in this assessment criteria, we are looking at broadly talking about resources that the organization would need in order to ensure that they are prepared and ready to meet any sort of contingency plan or any sort of a situation if faced within the premises or within an organization. Now, I would also add technical resources. So financial, we can understand that there should be adequate budgeting and finance available. Human resources could be dedicated people or people with experience, knowledge, and academic background to be able to work within that role of occupational health and safety. There could be facilities and equipment, which is something which we understand. But I would also add here technical resources, because technical resources are becoming quite important when we look at, to a certain extent, health and safety related to, say, for example, cyber attacks, which are to protect the organization's intellectual property. Or in some cases, it might disable some of the facilities, which is the IT infrastructure of the organization. And in such cases, technical resources would also need to be built in to ensure the functioning of the organization, if not health and safety, but functioning of the organization. Now, malicious viruses, or for example, server attacks, or bringing, equipment, IT equipment to a standstill or not making it work essentially through, I would say, some sort of malicious software could also be included in terms of mitigation strategies or resources that health and safety occupational officers would need within the organization. Now,
I didn't understand. So what are the technical resources? Sorry,
technical resources would be software or tools which are required to look at maintaining health and safety. A simple example in the related field that I would give you is, if you look at a large premises like us, which is a college, a lot of the doors are locked and opened not physically by locks, but essentially by equipment which is controlled through IT. So they are magnetic related equipment or equipment related to, for example, switching off the PC in all the classrooms, switching off all the electronics or projectors and laptops in the classroom. That can all be done remotely through the control room with security. They don't need to physically go into each of the rooms or each of the classrooms to be able to do that. Now, in certain cases, if classrooms need to be locked to protect, for example, physical property, which is in the college, then in those cases, these can be locked using technology. So there is systems in place or equipment in place, and these doors, we don't have traditional wooden doors with lock and key, but you have doors which can be shut and opened automatically. So in such cases, technology, it will become a resource which will help you manage health and safety within the organization. If you don't want anybody to get into any premises like a boardroom or, for example, certain areas, then you can electronically lock them using technology. So having technological resources also may be useful in today's context, because when we look at businesses with large premises or organizations with large physical oblique administrative equipment related infrastructure, then in such cases, risk assessment and or controlling of the infrastructure can be done using the tools, which is technology. I don't need to physically get up and go into each of the room and lock the door physically, which was maybe done 10 years back, 20 years back. So that is what I meant from a point of view of technological resources also required, to be able to have for the purposes of, planning and assessing and maintaining safety within an organization.
Yeah, and what are the as well the administrative resources?
So in administrative resources, you would generally look at, equipment which the people need to be able to work in that. For example, a security guard might need RFID card, which has access control to all the premises, and one card basically works in that particular direction. Administrative resources would mean that the person would have resources related to working and maintaining those things. For example, an office, a desk, a chair. It could be basic things like this, or it could be availability of PC and software to be able to manage some of these from a point of view of systems. Now, a specific example that I would give you here is that if a large organization, assuming it's an engineering organization or a call center, for example, a services organization, if they need to look at attendance monitoring because they work in shifts, one of the things which will be installed by the organization as an administrative resource, which will be used by people, would be a attendance machine or a attendance in and out machine. Now
Punch.
that could be an electronic resource, but used administratively to keep track of attendance rather than have manual record of a welcome register or a guest register. Nowadays, in most organizations, you see that if you go into the reception, you normally have a touch screen wherein the user can actually touch and enter their details. It takes a photograph and it prints out a guest or a visitor pass, and that could be seen as an administrative resource given to a receptionist, and that would allow the guest to move around in the premises with limited access to certain areas, and also help keep track of where the guest is if there was any sort of an incident like a fire or a breakout of electricity or whatever it is, and that would be considered as, I would say, an administrative resource. Is that okay?
Yeah.
So here again, what I've done is, to give it a bit of clarity, I have drawn up a bit of a table rather than put it, as a slide in terms of what could be the various resources that you could need when we do talk about, I would say, skills and resources required to maintain these health and safety standards. And these could be classified into actual physical resources like financial, administrative, physical, human resources, and then there could be some soft resources which you would need, which will be primarily related to things like training, development, communication skills, so that everybody is singing from the same songbook. Like today, one of the things which I was wanting to do was I was wanting to try and find out a policy which I could send across to a lot of employees. And in such cases, finding that resource and communicating that across on the email was important, because I needed to download it from the intranet, Once I downloaded the health and safety policy and the update which has come into it, I then drafted an email to ensure that everybody in the organization gets that email and tends to understand what this policy is and why the updated version is now being circulated for your reference. So in such cases, it'll be important to also have training and development and obviously communication, frequently done to keep everybody updated on changes which are happening with regards to health and safety standards within the organization. Is that okay?
Yeah.
That brings us to the end of today's discussion, and what I would do is to look at and some sort of additional reading for these three particular learning outcomes and assessment criteria. What I'm going to do is primarily suggest 2 or 3 case studies, and that I will upload onto Moodle just after this session. And these case studies, would be helping you understand in a practical sense what is the role of governance in an organization when we look at health and safety standards. What we've done is we've understood it theoretically, and I've touched on some examples briefly, but it'll be good for you to read a case study to see what is the role of governance in an organization wherein health and safety standards are very vital to the operations of the business. In my organization, it might not be very important. It is one of the policies. But in an organization which works in the field, in engineering sector or services sector, wherein there is continuous movements of goods or the continuous movement of people, this particular policy would take a lot of importance, and that is where you would need to get that idea by looking at these case studies.
Okay, sure.
Okay. That's great. So we will end this session here. And what I would do is upload the copy of the updated presentation, a copy of the recording, and the 2 or 3 case studies related to these topics onto Moodle. And I'll drop you a text message on WhatsApp so that you know that they've been done. And I'll see you in the next session.
Okay, and once I get the case studies, what is required from my side?
It is just for additional reading. It is for reading. At some stage, you might, when we look at discussing the assignment, some of the tasks, one of the things which I'll show you very quickly, which is a differentiation I want you to understand. When you look at the unit specification, you would see that they are all understand. They are all, theoretical. But at some stage, when we get to other units, there will be learning outcomes which will say be able to. That means in the assignments, you'll be required to show the practical output. You'll have to take practical examples. And that is where these case studies and articles will come in handy, because these are theoretical learning outcomes, but in some units, you'll have be able to, which would mean that you would need to show practical examples. And that is where case studies, articles, or some of the things that you're reading now in the units would come in handy.
Okay. So the case studies are different than those are available to read right now in the Moodle?
Yes, yes. I will keep updating as we do the learning outcomes, because in some cases, sometimes the discussion that we do would be more subjective and descriptive. So in order for you to pick out clear areas of where this works, how this works, it might be good for you to read these case studies, which could be 3, 4, 5 pages long, but it'll give you a very good understanding of what is the role of governance in health and safety, where it starts, how it's monitored, and things like that.
Okay, yeah, definitely. Sure.
Good stuff. So you have the rest of the evening to yourself. Enjoy it, and then I'll catch up with you in the next session. So till then, take care and bye for now.
Okay, the next session is on Saturday.
Saturday, yes.
Okay, thank you. Have a good day.